I'm going to go ahead and get started, and just out of respect for everybody's time, want to start right at 6:30. Our presenter has some wonderful information to go over, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. Just a couple of housekeeping items. This is being live streamed right now, so there's some folks watching remotely, and in order for them to hear everything that's being said, it has to be into a microphone. So our presenter, Terry, is going to have a microphone with him, and then I have this one that I'm going to take around the room, and if you have questions or comments, just raise your hand, and I'll come over and try to get to you as soon as I can. But if you can use the microphone, that would be greatly appreciated. And then this meeting is also going to be uploaded to YouTube, and so it will be added to our Homeowners Association page on the city's website, so you can come back and watch it however many times you need to. We also had the same topic about a year ago, and so that presentation is available on our website as well. Might be a little different information from what Terry's going to be going over tonight, but worth your review as well, for sure. One thing I do want to mention, this might not pertain to everybody here, but a change that is happening this year and moving forward through the coming years is the city used to host a HOA Academy, and that was an annual event that was kind of an all-day program. We're no longer going to be offering the Academy anymore. I know. Just changing projects and programs and priorities for the city. So we have to kind of realign some things. But I am still going to be making a very concerted effort to do these quarterly meetings. Usually we provide city specific information. So we'll have water resources come, or, tree trimming recommendations, things like that. And we'll still do that. But I am going to sprinkle in some more like board member education, training type topics similar to this, and similar to what you may have heard at an academy in the past. So we'll try to balance it out with providing some of that, some of those programs and trainings for you guys still at these quarterly meetings as well. So with that, I'm going to introduce Terry Leahy. He says semi-retired or just retired? Retired attorney. But I'll let him give some overview of his background and let you take it from here.
Well, thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Guess we should get started, right? Okay. I'm here wearing two hats tonight. Is this on? Yeah. Okay. I'm the only one that can't hear this. This picture was taken of me 10 years ago, and this was more recent. So I am an attorney. I'm still licensed. I'm quasi-retired. I'm now doing legal consulting, which is primarily working with lawyers, helping lawyers bounce ideas off with them. And my primary focus right now these days is on Mukaiwa and helping attorneys and some associations migrate from their current documents and their current operations to complying with Mukaiwa. I'm going to ask that you, if you can, hold your questions until I get to the end, because I try to build in enough time for there to be ample opportunity to have questions answered. The other hat I wear is and a member of an association. I'm a rare bird. There are very few homeowner association attorneys that actually live in an association. We sort of took a blood oath not to do that, and I broke it 3 years ago. I moved into a neighborhood that I really like in the greater Lacey area, and it's got a homeowners association, and so now I'm a member. And my take on tonight was that although I'm a lawyer, my focus tonight is with my homeowner hat on, because I went to CA Day, which is a educational event last weekend, and I usually present at those sessions, but this year I went as a homeowner, a very different experience. And when I was sitting in the audience, and the attorneys would be up there saying, well, you need to, which is what I would say as well, you need to change all of your documents, and that's going to be expensive. and it's going to be from $7,000 to $25,000, and that's just sort of the way it is. And then sitting in the audience, I'm going, no way. I am not going to. I'm not going to, contribute to paying for work that isn't necessary, which presupposes, that the possibility that there may be something short of entirely replacing your documents that might work. And so what I'm going to explore tonight is that possibility.
Can I ask you that you not use acronyms? So I'm familiar with WCAIA, but maybe people in the audience and the people streaming are not. So if you could not use,
Well,
that would be great.
here's what I will do. I will use WCAIA, but I will tell you now what WCAIA means, what it stands for, okay? Because if I used the whole thing, we'd be here all night. So it's the Washington Uniform Common Interest Ownership Act. The acronym is WCAIA, and I just call it the Act because it's going to be the Act for all intents and purposes for everybody in 2028. So I will just call it, if I remember, the Act tonight, okay? So a good place to start is to draw a distinction between a question and a problem, because a question has an answer. What is 1 + 1? It's 2. It has a definitive answer. A question like, how can we get somebody on the moon by the end of 2026? It's in the form of a question, but it's a problem. It states a problem. And the answer to that question is I don't know, I'll figure it out. And a lot of what migrating to WCAIA falls in, it's a problem. There's not a simple one solution answer to the question. It's a problem that we don't know. We're going to have to figure it out. And hopefully some of the information you'll get tonight will help you figure it out. I have a question. How many here are in a homeowners association as opposed to a condominium? Okay, how many here are in a condominium? Okay. Most of what you're going to hear tonight is focused on homeowner associations because it's a different animal than condominiums. So when I'm trying to figure something out, a good place for me to start is to ask why before what. So if you're going to be migrating to WCAIA, well, why? I mean, why does WCAIA exist? Why is it retroactive? What is it trying to accomplish? And the better you understand what WCAIA is intended to achieve, then the easier it will be for you to understand the requirements that it imposes. And what WCAIA is about is the simple notion that it's a partnership. If everybody in this room pooled our money and we bought a vacation home together or a mobile home together or RV together, whatever it is we pulled our money and bought together, well, by buying that thing together, we would then be the co-owners of that asset, whatever it is, okay? And now that we all co-own this asset, that makes us partners, right? Once we own this shared asset, the next thing we have to do is figure out, well, okay, well, how are we going to care for it over time, and how are we going to use it? And there's two ways of answering those questions. We basically would divide it into simple questions and complex problems. And that's what happens with developers. They will take the simple questions that have a definitive answer, and they can stick those in the covenants. But a lot of the questions that have to do with caretaking and use and things like that, a lot of those are complex problems they fall into the category of, I don't know, we'll have to figure it out, because you're going to have to decide them on a case-by-case basis. And so in their infinite wisdom, what the legislatures did around the country was they said, well, we know what's not going to work. If you have a bunch of co-owners or something, they're not going to unanimously agree on anything. That's not going to happen. And so we need to have some mechanism for them to be able to arrive at decisions and to implement the decisions once they've arrived at those decisions. And their solution to that problem was to require that these partnerships form a nonprofit corporation and be members of this corporation. And then this corporation would provide the framework for decision making. You know, owners would elect a board. The board would have authority to make decisions. And once those decisions were made, then it could implement those decisions. And that was a great solution in the short term. When developments, when you buy a new home or you buy a new anything, in the first few years of owning it, there's no problems. You know, it's under warranty or it's new and you're not going to have any problems. But as time goes on, then as things age, then problems come up, and the cost of addressing those problems go up as well. And as the problems got more expensive, then problems started to come up with this approach to decision making. So in corporate decision making, you've got two roles. You've got the decider, that's the board, and then you've got the stakeholders, which is everybody else that is impacted. That's all the other partners who are impacted by the decision that the board makes. And the typical corporate decision-making sequence is the board decides whatever it is that needs to be decided, and then after they've decided it, they disclose it to the stakeholders sooner or later. And that was fine in the early going because the decisions that they were making were not that consequential. But as time went on and the decisions that boards were making became more consequential, then the stakeholders were finding that they were being blindsided by these decisions that the board was making. Even though the board had the authority to make the decision, the owners who would have to fund the implementation of those decisions were like, wait, how did you arrive at this? And so what happened at the legislature is that the stakeholders, the members of associations, they revolted. They went to their legislators, and this happened first in the last century, and that was responded, the response to that was to create the Homeowners Association Act, which was a cut and paste job by some legislative staff people. They took parts of the Condominium Act and they cut and pasted it, and they enacted it into law, and that was the Homeowners Association Act. Fast forward a little bit, and the stakeholders started to revolt again, and at this point, it was around 2005-ish, and I was the chair of the Legislative Action Committee for the Washington chapter of Community Association Institute. And that session was sort of a whack-a-mole session. You had disgruntled owners pigeonholing their elected representatives, saying, this is a problem, and there should be a law that says this, that should, that it should say that, and they shouldn't be able to do this, and I should be able to do that. And so there was this rash of proposed amendments to the Homeowners Association Act, which would have just made life even more unbearable for boards. It would just not, a lot of those solutions were not solutions that would do anything other than to depreciate the value of the properties. So we convinced the legislature that they shouldn't enact legislation without fleshing out what are the unintended consequences. And we said, what you ought to do, legislature, is you ought to listen first to what the concerns are, what the problems are, and then when you're fully apprised of what the problems are, then you can pass legislation that solves those problems. But that's a process you should follow. And the legislature said, well, that's fine, but you're going to do it, not us. And so they created a homeowners association task force. And so I got stuck on that. And so for 18 months, we took many, many hearings where homeowners who had been complaining to their legislators came to our hearings and they voiced their concerns to us. We listened to them and we tried to come up with viable solutions to them. And we came back to the legislature with a report and 19 recommendations and put those recommendations in the form of essentially rewriting the Homeowners Association Act. In the main thrust of those recommendations, and the main thing that we heard in all of that testimony was owners were essentially saying, look, my neighbor and I were equal. We both are co-owners of the common property. And my neighbor who's on the board is making decisions that impact me and I don't have any say. And we eventually figured out, oh, well, it's because the decision making is backwards. In a true partnership, like a marriage, you may have a decider for some issue, but you listen to your partner before you make the decision. I guess an example might be, let's say that I had a milestone anniversary coming up, and my wife and I decided, let's go to Hawaii. That's what we should do. But I also I wear the recreational hat. So I'm the decider for recreational matters in our marriage. And she is the decider for entertainment matters in our family. And so for our anniversary, we decide we're going to surprise each other. We don't disclose this to each other, but because I'm the decider in my realm and I've got the authority to decide, and likewise for her. And so I surprise her with his and her e-bikes. And she surprises me with a round-trip tickets and room to a Bruno Mars concert in Vegas. And great surprises. But as a consequence of our decisions, Hawaii went out the window because all the money that would have funded the Hawaii trip was spent on our surprises to each other. Now, each of us had, within our marriage, the authority to make the decision. I was the decider, she was the decider. I had authority, she had authority. But the things that we were making decisions on were consequential. And we didn't know because we didn't ask. And the takeaway from something like that is, okay, well, there are certain decisions within a partnership that even if somebody has the decision-making authority, if it's a decision that is going to impact other members of the partnership, then the wise thing to do to strengthen the bonds within the partnership is to run it by the other partners. And run it by is different from having them decide it, because the decider is still the decider. But the decider is going to make a better decision, a less impactful decision on the other stakeholders if they listen to what concerns those stakeholders have before they make the decision. And so that was the thrust of the changes that we were recommending. And so that was in, so what we were dealing with was, corporate principles that in RCW 6438, that is the HOA Act. And what we have now and are dealing with is partnership principles that are embedded in WCIWA. But these listen first, then decide principles, we proposed them back in 2008, and the legislature said no. And then fast forward 10 years, and the legislature decides they're going to pass Wukiwa, which is based on listen first, then decide. And it says it's going to be prospective only. It's not going to apply retroactively to any association that existed before July of 2018. And then you get to 2024, but in 2018, Wukiwa, as it came out, it had a provision that said you don't have to comply, existing associations, but we have created a streamlined method for you to opt in to Wukiwa, so you can get all the benefits of Wukiwa. And the response to that for most associations was a resounding no. And the main objection that existing associations had to that was this notion of listening first, then deciding, because the form it would take would be giving more notice of meetings, and it just, the existing way of making decisions was so ingrained within the industry that there was just this hard pushback on that. So fast forward to 2024, and now the legislature says, okay, well, we invited you to come into the fold, and you rejected us. So now the invitation's gone. Now it's mandatory. We're going to give you time to do it. We're going to give you to 2028 to do it. But all existing associations are going to have to migrate over to operating within the framework of Wukiwa by January 1 of 2028. So we still had some time. You could still opt in if you wanted to earlier, but associations still weren't doing it. Again, because they didn't want to change the way that they were making decisions. That oversimplifies it, but that was, there was this strong pushback to listen first, then decide. This last session, the legislature said, okay, we've had it. You're going to have to migrate to Wukiwa by January 1 of 2028, but we're going to phase it in. And phase 2 is the rest of Wukiwa. Phase 1 is 2026. You're going to have to do this in 2026. What are you going to have to do? Well, you're going to have to change how you do meetings. You're going to have to do listen first, then decide. And so, association said no, and the legislature said now. So there's phase 1, which takes effect in 2026, and phase 2, which is 2028. So when boards I work with are confronted with some problem that they've got to triage, they need to figure out how to, what do we do? One of the most effective tools that I've come up with over the years and used is 3 questions asked in this sequence. It's must we, may we, should we? And the first question, must we? So does the board have a mandatory legal duty to act or refrain from acting? Because if it's mandatory, then they must do it. It's not discretionary. May we? What if the board doesn't have a legal duty to do something? Does the board have authority to do this thing? And should we? If the board has no duty to act, but it does have authority to act, well, then should it act? And if so, how? So if you take these questions and you apply this to Wukiwa, phase 1. Phase 1 is a must. Must we? Yes. Phase 1 is mandatory. RCW 6490-445, the asterisk indicates that there are other sections that are that take effect in 2026. But the most consequential for associations is the meeting requirement. And then the second 2026 change that is consequential is Senate Bill 5686, which imposes a mandatory collection process that associations have to follow. Now, I don't do collections. I always had other attorneys within my firm do collections, and so I would just always phase that out. But when I went to the workshop last weekend, entire session was focused on this collection process. And if you have a collections attorney, then your collections attorney is presumably versed on this and may already be providing you with a method of complying with this. But the main takeaway for tonight is that once a delinquency is, I think it's 30 days past due, the 30th day triggers this process that you have to send out a statutory notice, and that starts this whole mediation process. Whoever your collections attorney is that you work with, they should be advising you on this, and if they're not, then you need to be contacting them to see what you need to do to comply with that. But these laws taking effect creates what I call the invisible ink problem, because these take effect and they impact you in your associations, but they're not in your documents. So they override whatever is in your documents. And if you're on your board, then what you're accustomed to doing when a question comes up is you pull out your governing documents and you look through to see, well, what are we required to do? Because your governing documents are sort of your operating system. You want to comply with the law, and so you look to your governing documents because they're based upon the law, is the thinking. Well, they are, but they aren't. They're overridden in some ways by what the statutes now impose. And so an invisible ink problem is consequential because it gets weaponized. In the first half of my career, before I worked with boards, I was hired by owners to represent them in their disputes with boards. And it was pretty easy to do because there a lot of the things that boards do, they do, or they're supposed to do, according to a particular process. And what often happens is the process exists on paper, but the board gets used to doing things the way that they do it. And when I would get hired, I would look at the process, look at what they're supposed to do, and then I would look at what they actually did. And, usually there was a gap between what they were supposed to do and what they actually did. And that gap would give me leverage to get whatever result my client was trying to get. But the second half of my career, I switched to representing boards. And I started my law firm at that point, where the mission of the law firm was basically to prevent associations from getting sued. I mean, what we brought to our associations was the knowledge of how to sue them, and the knowledge that a lot of the lawsuits that were brought against associations were lawsuits that wouldn't have been brought if they just behaved a different way. And so we tried to bring that to our clients and cause them to behave in a different way. And basically, one of the main things that we guided them to do differently was to listen first, then decide. The most important for your purposes section of Phase 1 of Kiowa is Section 445, Sub 2. That's the section that deals with board meetings. And I highlighted as the first item, even though it's 2L, it's near the end of the list. But for your purposes, it's the most important. It is a fish or cut bait provision. And it says, look, it doesn't say look, I added that. It says non-compliance with these procedures is waived unless an action is brought within 90 days. And so what that means is that if you didn't do one of the things that I'm going to go over with you, because it was invisible, or for whatever reason you just didn't do it, as long as the not doing it was in good faith. If you slipped up and it didn't happen, without that fish or cut bait, you would have an owner or the owner's lawyer, somebody like me, saying, look, the decision you made is invalid because you didn't give the right notice. Back when I was representing owners, Ken here was the other attorney in this one. I was representing an owner who wanted to stop a major repair. And the attorney for the association came in sort of late in the game. The board had made a decision and signed a contract with the contractor to do the repair work, but they didn't have the authority to sign the contract because they had not followed the right procedure. And so on behalf of the owner, I was saying, well, you've signed this contract, but you have no authority to do so because you didn't follow the right process. This helps boards deal with somebody like I used to be. Because if somebody is upset with the decision that the board made and wants to make an issue out of it because they didn't follow the right procedure as laid out here, they have to file a lawsuit within 90 days of the minutes coming out that announce the decision. Now, if they file the lawsuit and they lose the lawsuit, then they're on the hook for attorney fees. And what owners sometimes do is if a board makes a decision, an owner may say, well, you did it wrong, the decision is invalid, but it just creates an impasse that just goes on and on and on. It's just this cloud that hangs. You never know whether the owners are going to file a lawsuit or not. They can go 3 years and then file the lawsuit at the end of 3 years, and you're just under the cloud for the whole time. What this does is it says, no, that's not going to work. The cloud's there for 90 days. If you don't bring your lawsuit, then we're moving on. What 445, the highlights of what it requires is that your meetings be open except for executive session, and there's a list of things that you can discuss in executive session. Now, most of you are homeowner associations, and so you're already under the Homeowners Association Act, you're already used to holding open meetings. The second thing it says is social contacts between members of the board is not a meeting, as long as you're not conducting business at that meeting. There's a requirement of owner comment. And I watched the seminar that was given in July of 2024 by Scott, is that his name? And the question I think came up at that time, well, this owner comment right that owners have, does that mean that they can speak up at any time during the meeting? And it was unclear at that time whether they could or they couldn't, but that has been clarified in the last session. There needs to be an opportunity for owners to speak at the meeting, but if the item that they want to speak about is an item that is on the agenda, then they need to be provided with that opportunity before you get to that part of the agenda and vote on it. And the reason for that is what was happening is a lot of boards would have the owner period, comment period set for the end of the meeting. And sometimes if the meetings ran long, then the owners would go away and it was a very brief owner comment period. And so that was sort of the norm, was let them talk at the end. But a lot of the people that were coming to meetings with something to say, what they wanted to talk about was an item on the agenda that the board was going to vote on. But by the time they had a chance to say something, the board had already made the decision. And so what the legislature said was, well, look, if their whole reason for coming to the board meeting and for speaking up is to give the board information that they want the board to consider before the board makes a decision, then they ought to have that opportunity at the front end. And so that's why the legislature framed it that way, that the first 15 minutes of your meeting is a comment period for owners to comment on something on the agenda. If it's not a matter on the agenda, then it can be later in the meeting. The notice period, this was probably the biggest pushback that explained what happened, the no's that kept happening. Because it requires 14 days notice to the owners of every meeting before the board meets. And that's untenable, because a lot of the decisions that boards need to make, they need to make on a shorter time period than that. But the legislature provided a couple of workarounds. One is it said, well, you don't need to give the 14 days notice if you published a schedule, a meeting schedule, and gave that to all of the owners at the time you created the schedule. That suffices. And so that's what a lot of associations are already doing. When they elect their board, the first thing they do is they set a meeting schedule for the year. They send it out to everybody, with a form agenda that covers most of the things that they would cover at a meeting, and that takes care of your 14 days notice. The next thing was that non-confidential board materials need to be made reasonably available. Well, there's some question about what does that mean, that we need to mail non-confidential board packets out to all of the owners before every meeting? No, you just need to make it reasonably available. And what attorneys are opining is that, well, as long as you provide them with the means to make a request for that information and a way for them to get that information if they request it, then that's reasonably available. And the policy idea behind it is that owners who are interested in the decisions that the boards are going to make ought to have an opportunity to see what the board is seeing, see what the board is considering. And so if they have something important to contribute, then they can do so. I mean, if they didn't have ability to see the materials and all they had was the ability to go to the meeting and speak up, then as often as not, what would happen is the person would get up, they would say, well, I have a concern about this thing that's on the agenda. And then the board would be sitting there thinking, well, yeah, what he doesn't know is that in the materials it says this, that, and the other thing that already address that. So if the interested person has equal access to the board materials, if they're so inclined to read them, and they can inform themselves before, then they may not even need to go to the meeting, because the question that they had may be answered when they look at the materials. And so it's just another example of this listen first, then decide idea. And the last thing, which boards also didn't like, is that right now, boards can make unanimous written decisions without a meeting. And a lot of decisions that boards make, over the course of a year, are decisions that they make by email until they reach unanimous consensus of this is the decision we should do. They'll ratify it at the next meeting. But all the business is taking place in those emails going back and forth. What the legislature has said is, no, you can't do substantive business by email anymore. Decision-making needs to take place publicly, where owners have the right to comment and the right to witness what you're doing. That's the whole idea of transparency. Because my owner clients, when I would represent owners, if a board met in secret, my client would convincingly describe to me all of the conspiratorial things that occurred in that secret meeting. And over time, I came to realize that some of my owner clients were not reliable narrators of what happened in the room that they couldn't see. But that was the reason why the legislature said, we're going to close that loophole. Yes?
Ministerial action, what's that mean?
Can I, wait. So the question is, what does ministerial action mean? And the answer is, I don't know. I'll figure it out. Because it is and that actually came up at CA Day. And went up and what does ministerial mean? And the lawyers were like, that's a good question. It's not defined. There's a number of terms that are used in the act that go undefined. And so what lawyers do is they look to other sources to come up with an interpretation. And the most likely meaning of that is if it's not a decision. Let's say, for example, that the board makes a decision at a meeting that it is going to hire contractor X. And then they authorize the, how would this work? They might say, okay, all the contractor needs to do is get us these three things. Once we have these three things, then we'll sign the contract. Well, they don't have the three things at the meeting. They get the three things a few days later, and then the board meets and says, okay, by email, we have the three things. Now I can sign the contract. Well, the signing the contract, once those three things are present, that's ministerial. There's no new decision being made. And so it's trying to draw a distinction between activity that is decision-making, deliberating and decision-making, and activity that is implementing a decision that was already reached in public. So if it's implementing a valid decision, that's ministerial. That's the intent behind the word. And that's a good example of the why before what, where they don't supply the what, supply a definition, you're left with trying to discern, well, why did they use that word? What was the purpose of the requirement that they imposed? The Homeowners Association statute was amended to add a list of Phase 1 items that take effect in January 1 of 2026. Their meetings, which we just talked about. There's a provision about emergency powers that statutorily gives you authority to do certain things in a public emergency. There's an EV charging provision that slightly changes the existing EV charging statute. There's budgeting reserve study, which are already they're already in effect. And then there's a provision about heat pumps, which changes an existing statute on heat pumps. And I couldn't tell you the particulars of the EV charging or the heat pumps, just because I didn't go there. So if you have this invisible ink problem, you've got documents that don't reflect what the law is now. And because they don't reflect what the law is now, you run the risk of unintentionally violating the law. What the lawyers are saying is, well, in order to solve the invisible ink problem, you need to fix your documents, fix the flaws in your documents. Well, it's important to know that there are at least 5 methods of fixing flawed documents. And in order of severity, clarify is like physical therapy. It's non-intrusive. This would be where the board exercises its authority as a board to pass a resolution or to adopt a policy. And this is something that the board can do. As a board, they don't need an owner's vote. And we used to do that with homeowner associations, that when the budgeting requirement was first enacted, and it was at odds with what was in their governing documents. We would prepare a resolution that basically said, look, we're the board, we acknowledge that there's this law that requires us to handle budgets in a certain way. And so we are going to follow the law. And I think in those ones we would attach a copy of the piece of the law that they were going to comply with. And that made the invisible provision visible for the board. So that was an easy fix to the invisible ink problem. The second is a patch. And this is where you amend the declaration to solve a very specific problem. In condominiums, it was often when they needed major repairs, it would turn out that they did not have borrowing authority. And banks would say, well, we're not going to loan to this association unless they have borrowing authority. And so we would have owners adopt an amendment that was very narrow and just said, yeah, they have borrowing authority, so that they could proceed with their repairs. That was a patch. A retrofit, that's more invasive surgery. That would be where we would deal with some issue. Quite often it was insurance for condominiums. And while we were at it, we thought, well, let's clean up some of the other things. And so the main provision would be the insurance provision, but then there would be 14 other provisions that would eliminate this sentence, add 3 sentences there, housekeeping type changes. The next most extensive is swap out. And this is where you would take an entire existing provision and you would rip it out and you would throw in a new provision in its place, like joint replacement. And this is most often done in condominiums in the context of a major repair where they've got a damage instruction provision that would apply, but the process is screwed up. And we would pull that out and replace it with a provision that set out a very clean process. And then the last and most intrusive is replace the documents. That's like dying and remarrying the surviving spouse. So the one that died, no need to remarry. And this would be where you replace your existing documents in their entirety with new documents. Now, what a lot of lawyers, myself included, have been discussing, especially with condominium boards, is replacing their existing documents with new documents that comply with the must provisions of WCIWA, but also take advantage of all of the authority that WCIWA confers upon boards that opt into them. So putting my owner's hat on again, and imagine that I own a home in Heavenly Acres. My actual association has a different name, but pretty close to that. Well, in phase one, that is occurring in 2026, that's a must. And so there needs to be some action taken to address the invisible ink problem. But this may be one that can be addressed with a policy and with changing some practices to comply with the policy. The policy would be like the budgeting one that I talked about before, where the policy says there's this law that applies, and we're going to comply with the law, and this is what the law requires us to do. But probably more important is to align your practices with what the policy says. And if you have management, how many here work with management companies? And then how many are self-managed? The self-managed ones, do you have your own attorney that you, on an as-needed basis, consult? Okay. Well, you may need to get a name, but you can solve the invisible ink problem probably for 445 through a policy and through revising your practices. Now, short of hiring a lawyer, or in addition to hiring a lawyer, I already mentioned the Washington chapter of Community Association Institute. And I don't know how much it would cost to join that, but it's less than a lawyer. It's a great resource for good information about WCIWA. Because if you join, you get automatic access to all of the articles that they have been writing. And I just got the latest issue this afternoon, and it's got a number of articles about how to migrate to WCIWA. And a lot of them have to do with the practices. What practices can you put in place to make it easier for you to comply with what you need to comply with? Now, phase two, 2028. So it's coming down the road. And on January 1 of 2028, then all of WCIWA is going to apply to all associations. And WCIWA has some must provisions, and it's got a lot of may provisions. And the may provisions are sort of best practices that got placed in the statute. And so a lot of those are things that without WCIWA, we would have to add by amending existing documents. And WCIWA is basically going to supply them for you automatically. You're just not going to see them. So there are three, you can put them in three boxes, in terms of how you migrate to phase two. So if you think of Goldilocks, the three chairs, the small one would be using policies to surface invisible ink problems, must problems. That's probably not going to be very viable approach to addressing all that you need to address in WCIWA. But It's theoretically possible. The medium one for an HOA would be to either opt in sooner if you're ready. There's an easy procedure to opt into Ukiah before 2028 if you choose to do so. If you don't do that, then it just automatically applies. And for, I think, a lot of smaller associations, homeowner associations, what that's going to look like is probably getting replacement bylaws and then just fixing the covenants where the covenants are inconsistent with something that is in Ukiah, okay? And the reason for new bylaws is bylaws are typically, they're supposed to deal with process and procedure. And my experience dealing with bylaws for associations is bylaws are pretty close from one association to the next. Where a lot of the variation occurs is in the covenants. So getting a new set of bylaws that are fully compliant with Ukiah is probably going to be easier than trying to patch your bylaws. But then when you come to your covenants, that may be more a situation where you look through certain provisions and you figure out what's the best fix. Like for homeowner associations, the Architecture Control Committee provision is going to be a big area of focus because one of the things Ukiah does is it requires that any board authority decision-making take place with, if it's through a committee, that there be at least 2 board members on the committee, and those 2 board members are the only one that can vote on the decision for the committee. And that's not how most ACCs are set up. Most ACCs are set up where the board appoints some other owners who have or are willing to spend some time on this, and they make the decision, and the board maybe hears an appeal if there's a process for that, but quite often the board is just out of the loop on that. That's not going to work anymore. Unless we get the legislature to change that, you're going to have to change your documents to align your ACC process with what the statute allows. The large version would be to opt in and get new bylaws and get new covenants, including contentious topics. And what I have found, I've done a number of document replacement projects for associations. And one of the 2 things that I'm finding that makes a difference between how inexpensive or expensive it is one is, do they try to tackle contentious issues? If in a condo, do they try to impose a rental cap where one doesn't exist yet? Or do they want to change use restrictions to outlaw smoking or to, require more screening for RVs? Or, the use restrictions are a lightning rod for contention. And so if they try to get changes to the use restrictions in as part of the project grinds to a halt. Or it keeps going along, but it becomes very, very expensive and very divisive. And so we've found it more effective to say, okay, look, if we need new documents, let's do new documents, but let's make those documents focus on the best practices and table the controversial stuff to be tackled a year or 2 down the road. And so we're just going to keep the use restrictions that are a source of contention as is, and we'll deal with them down the road. Yes?
I just had a question that's, I think the large would be very expensive though, because you have to, not only do you have to get somebody to type these all up and write them, but then you actually have to send them out as well, and you have to send the originals out and then show the new ones and all the changes, and it's a very time consuming and a very expensive, I heard like thousands of dollars.
Yes. And the comment was for you people on the internet, doing the big fix would be very expensive because you would have to generate new documents in their entirety. You'd have to send them out to owners, and owners would have to eventually approve them. And that would be very expensive. It is very expensive. And on that first slide, the Atticus person, if Atticus was asked, well, how expensive, you'd probably hear him say, well, I had one association do it for $7,000, and you're thinking, I'm not going to spend $7,000. And then he says, but that was a cheap one. I've never come close to that after that. It's 15 to 25. That's what it is, And the owner in me is like, no, we're not going there. The other way that I found to keep the expense down is to use what I call a steward. Because I've dealt with communities that had a committee, and then I had ones that had a steward. I call it a steward. And the committees, that went slow, and nobody really owned the project. Whereas if in a community there's one person that takes full ownership of the project, and they're sometimes on the board, but quite often they're not a board member. That one person says, okay, I am going to herd the cats. I'm going to essentially become your paralegal attorney. I'm going to do as much of the legwork as I can do without a law license, and I will use you as my consultant. But we're going to get, and I will get the comments, and I'll, do the process, and you just coach me, and we'll get it done. Well, that really drives down the cost of the process. It often makes it easier to approve because that person is usually a trusted member of the community. And everybody else sees that person working really hard. They already trust the person anyway, but they see how hard the person is working to make sure that everything is right. And that just earns more trust. That person, the most recent amendments, I used to show up at the meetings, the owner town hall meetings where there were questions. And we decided, no, let's have the steward handle that meeting. And the steward can say, look, I worked on the documents. I know these backwards and forwards. And there may be some questions that only the attorney can answer. And if there are any questions like that, I'll get an answer from the attorney. But let's just do it. Let's just have this town hall meeting with us, the partners. And that goes a long way toward smoothing the approval process. And so it's where the less you have the attorney involved, the better off things seem to go. And last two slides. The backdrop of all of this and what I learned over the years in terms of how to keep my associations out of litigation, and not always successful, but was that culture comes first. And there are basically two cultures within homeowner associations. There is what I call a consumer culture, and then there is a contribution culture. Now, the consumer culture, this is the one on the left. Let's see if this rings a bell with any of you. So you have, everybody's in the same boat. You have the coxswain there at one end. Nobody else is rowing. The person closest to the coxswain is yelling to the coxswain, row faster. And then everybody else who isn't rowing is saying, I'm really not enjoying this ride at all. Whereas in a contribution culture, you have the coxswain first checking in with everybody saying, look, this is where we're going to go. unless you guys think we should go somewhere else, but let me know. Listens to what people say, makes a decision. It's okay. This is where we're going. But we're only going to get there if everybody here does their fair share, if everybody pulls on their oar. And that's the only way that the really good associations work, is if every owner takes ownership of their responsibility to contribute to the success of the venture, or the joint venture that they're involved in. And there are two communities where I was part of the group that worked really, really hard to create that culture of contribution. And one of the main things that we did was, whenever an issue came up, we would always look at that as an opportunity to address that issue in a way that strengthened the union between the members of the partnership. And it was often hard to figure out, well, what can we do that will strengthen it? But if we started with that as our mantra, we were usually able to do something that calmed the temperatures and allowed the community to get through whatever issue they had in a way that they didn't fracture, and they were stronger. And there was, this will be the last example I'll give, and then I'll open it to questions. In one of the communities that we did this, we were hoping that all of this effort was going to bear fruit at some point. But then one day, there was a house on the main drag, and they had gone through ACC approval. They got this color approved for their house, and on the little swatch, it looked fine. But when they put that color across all of the house, it was horrible. It was a clown house. It was just, it was just horrible. And I get a call and said, yeah, we got a clown house, And that's a certain category of problems that lawyers have to solve, and it's really messy, and things don't go well. People aren't happy. But 20 minutes later, I get a second phone call from the manager and said, oh, don't worry, problem solved. I said, well, what happened? So, well, the owner drove up, saw the color, and made a beeline for the office and said, I am so sorry. I don't, we'll change it. We'll get another thing in there, we'll change it. We're letting the neighbors know. And the key was that in that neighborhood, by that point, the neighbors had developed a strong relationship, and they cared about each other. And so when the owner saw the house, what they didn't think about, I had the right to do this. They thought, geez, I can't imagine being my neighbor and looking at this, okay? And if you think about, the value of that relationship in your own communities, when I go out and it's pouring out, as it does here, and I'm bringing in my garbage cans, I'm not bringing them in because there's a rule that says I'm going to get a fine if I don't bring them in, although there is a rule that says I'll get a fine if I don't bring them in. I bring them in because I care about my neighbors. And everything I do, caring for my yard and bringing those in, everything is a sign of respect for my neighbors. And it's reciprocal. If I behave in a way that says I care about them, then most respond in a way that reflects that they care about me. And then the last thing I'll say is, this neighborhood that I bought into, we were trying to decide between two neighborhoods. And the other neighborhood had the nicer house plan and had a lot of bells and whistles. But what decided it for us was the neighborhood we bought in. When we drove into the neighborhood, everybody waved at us. And the other neighborhood, nobody waved. And so we pull up to the house, and we go into the house and we come out of the house, and this is like 95 degrees out. It's really bad. The neighbor across the street had come out, her 2 kids had come out, and they set up a lemonade stand so that they could give us lemonade and tell us about all the neighbors on the street and what they were like. And that was when the sale occurred. And so that's the value of creating this contribution culture. Are there any questions? And hearing none, we'll just wrap this up. Oh, wait, there might actually be some. I was joking.
I just wanted to make sure that I get the microphone to whoever has a question. We'll start back here.
I'm in the minority of people here who are involved with a condo association. And you did say when you were taking the count at the beginning that you were mainly going to focus on HOAs. What do you, all of this stuff applies to condo associations.
Right,
also.
yeah.
So what's the distinction?
No, really just one. I don't have to repeat the question because you had a microphone, This will speed things up. Mainly one, where I talked about the 3 different sizes, and I said the medium size, you can fix the covenants. That works better. That's a more viable approach for a homeowner association than it is for a condominium. Because in a condominium, a lot of the information and instructions, operating instructions from the statute are embedded in the declaration with a condominium. Limited common elements, who's allocations of responsibilities to fund things, to care for things. That's very complicated in a condominium in ways that it's not in a homeowners association. And so the statute provides a lot of operating instructions on that get into a declaration. And so with condominiums, it's a lot easier to start with a new declaration that is based on the new statute, and then blend, and that's most of what I do right now is with condominiums. And what we do is we take my base documents, which are based on the statute, and then we look at the existing documents and see what existing provisions make sense to pull forward. Either because they're unique to this community or it works or whatever. And so there's this blending that occurs where there's the new document and a blending of the existing provisions into the new document. So that's sort of the standard approach with a condominium for that reason.
You talked about confidential information in board packets and what needs to be distributed to people attending and what doesn't. Now, using the definition of confidential in executive session, is that the same confidential in board packets? Because our problem is, how do we protect owners from owners by keeping personal information out, like the delinquents and accounts, ACRs with signatures and stuff like that? Is there a different confidential for open session than it is from an exec session?
No. So the way to find, the way to determine what to keep out of information that goes to owners is found in 2 places. One, in 445, where it describes the 5 things that you can do in executive session. And so all of those things are confidential, so anything that fits into one of those 5 boxes. But then there is also a provision for records. Now, that doesn't apply until 2028, but it's also best practices. And so it has within that list of records information about which records you need to redact, which ones you need to keep confidential and how to keep them confidential. And so if you take those 2 sections and then extrapolate a list that captures the information from those two sections, then that's a pretty safe bet.
I got here a little bit late, but I was just curious if this presentation is going to be sent out email.
What's that?
If this presentation can be sent out in email so we can review it. I
The PowerPoint, sure.
Yeah, I took
Sure.
some notes, but I wanted to, if we had the presentation that we can kind of review it.
Yeah,
later.
you have my consent.
I'll send that out to everybody following this meeting.
I'm just feeling really stressed because our association is going to have to do a large assessment to get our storm pond up to snuff, which has been neglected for several decades. And then right on the heels of that, we have to hire a lawyer and do all this. It just feels really overwhelming.
Yeah, so, what she was describing is a situation which is periodically common in every association, which is they have some major cost item that needs to be attended to. And it's very expensive to have the lawyer help with that process, and it's even more expensive to fund that. And I don't, are you homeowners association or condominium?
Homeowners.
Okay, well, so this is what has happened in the condominium area, and I believe would translate to the homeowners association arena, okay? Condominiums have major repairs. A lot of them have reached the end of their useful life for exteriors and pipes and stuff, and they have multi-million-dollar repairs. And I had one association where 32 units, $8 million worth of repairs. One unit's assessment was $450,000 for that one unit. Okay, and they were actually this miracle story because the president of that association did that. This too shall strengthen our union thing. But they got a loan. So what has happened in that arena, and I think will happen in homeowner associations for major projects, is lenders will make loans to associations, as long as they get the right security for the loans and the associations qualify. And what happens is owners within in the association fall into two groups. The ones that can make a lump sum assessment and the ones that can't. And so for the ones that can't, what associations do is they get the loan to bridge the gap so that they can pay the contractor. And the source for the repayment of that loan is installment payments from the people that went the installment payment option. Okay, and one of the ways that one of the pieces of that that lawyers often do is they will amend the governing. They will have the owners amend the governing documents to lay out a process, a decision-making process that the community will follow to arrive at a decision that will then be implemented, and the loan terms are part of that process. And so within condominium associations, that amendment and then the ability to get the loans has brought the stress level down, because without lenders, before these lenders came into the market, it used to be that there was just the lump sum assessment, and the people that could pay and the people that couldn't. And the people that couldn't pay would hire me back in the day. And my job was to stop the repairs because they couldn't pay their assessment. And the only way they could save their home was to stop the project for everybody. So that was good for them and bad for everybody. those lawsuits don't happen so much anymore because these lenders have come in and this framework for getting through a major ordeal like that is how they're dealt with these days. Much less stressful. I mean, you still have to pay, but much less stressful than the olden days. So there's hope, not relatively more hope.
Our governing documents were set up by the builders that built the houses, and then were finally turned over to the association. But one of the things in the governing documents is that you cannot make any changes without a quorum of homeowners. How do we get around that? Because there is no way we're going to ever have a quorum of homeowners.
The attorney always has to look at the precise language of your documents, but there are workarounds for a lot of obstacle type language. Let's say I've dealt with ones, for example, where it says to change the declaration, you need the signatures of 75% of the homeowners. And it when you read it, it seems like they have to all have their signatures notarized in the presence of a notary public. And that's never going to happen. I mean, that's so overkill. And so we would come up with workarounds that we'd have owners sign an agreement. Each owner would be voting by signing an agreement that, approved the change and authorized the president and the secretary to sign the document on their behalf at the time it went to recording. And so we had to get their signatures on these agreements, but that's no different than getting their signature on a ballot or on a consent form. And so using that, we were able to collect the signatures we needed from the owners. There was no quorum. There's a statute that allows, and it operates independent of the homeowners association. Well, I think actually it is in the Homeowners Association Act right now, but it allows for voting by ballot. So if it's something that needs the approval of the owners, then it may be possible under this provision to use the balloting process to get the consents that you need, the approval that you need to record it. And then the other thing that we do sometimes is rather than try to get everybody's signature to approve a document that has all sorts of changes, we get people to approve one provision, and that's the amending provision. And so, and it just says, we're going to take out this cumbersome process, and we're going to replace it with a normal process. And then once that, and it's hard to get those signatures, but it's not as hard because all you're asking them to do is to approve one narrow change, which is non-controversial, and you pull it out of Ukiah, you borrow it from Ukiah, and then once you have that in place, then you use that process. So there are, that's a common problem, but there are solutions. Yes. Wait, you all right? You have to wait your turn the second time. Yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to actually say something beyond that, what you were saying. Because we had one similar to that we were able to take care of. And, okay, sorry. But, yeah, we had a situation in our HOA that was just a minor change, but we had to do the legwork. We had to go knock on doors because you're not going to get all these people to show up at a meeting. You're not ever going to get quorum. So you got to do a lot of legwork and knock on doors and get people to sign it.
Yeah, it's a SWAT team, we call it. Yes.
So my question is, I heard that in Ukiah, there's an exemption for small homeowners, that if it's less than 50 owners and less than 1,000 annual dues, that they're exempted from Ukiah. Have you heard that or seen that?
Yes, I've seen it, and no, it's not as good as it sounds. Because that was one of the things that changed in the last session. In 2024, it operated sort of the way that you described it, which is, look, if it's really a small association, then we're not going to require it to comply with all this stuff. That was replaced with one that says, look, if you're really, in effect says, if you're just as small as we were talking about last time, then the only sections of Ukiah that apply to you are these sections. And then it's almost every section, you know. And I was asking another attorney, you know, what's up with that? And the answer was, well, when Ukiah takes effect in 2028, the Homeowners Association Act will disappear. And what these sections here do is they carry forward the concepts that are in the Homeowners Association Act that still need to operate. Okay, so it basically resurrects the important stuff out of the Homeowners Association Act. So it doesn't help you much.
Just to clarify, implementation of phase 1 is 1/1/26?
January 1, 2026. Well, and implementation means that's when it takes effect. So if in the real world it takes effect and you aren't quite there yet, then that's where the fish and cut bait helps you. Because if you stumble and you screw up unintentionally, then that's wiped away unless somebody files a lawsuit within 90 days. Yes.
You've mentioned a number of times option to opt in sooner than not. Opting in does what? And then the second part of that is the small, medium, and large. Opting in medium, just do the bylaws and what needs to be done and contentious for later. New bylaws, is that part of opting in or?
So, yeah, good question. All the other questions were good too, but this was particularly a good question. Opting in is a process that Ukiah provides that basically says, look, if you don't want to wait until 2028 and you want to get into, you want Ukiah to apply to you sooner, you may opt into Ukiah by either amending your governing documents using your normal approval percentage, or then it has a special speedy way, or you can opt in by amending your declaration to opt in by a vote of by a vote that has a quorum established, and if 67% of the people who vote to opt in, then you've opted in. Well, that works out to about 26%, you know, depending upon what your quorum is. You can opt in with as low as 22.5% of a vote, okay? But, and some associations are doing that. They're just saying, we're going to opt in. And the lawyers are saying, well, now you understand, if you opt in, then Ukiah, all of it applies to you now. And all of the must stuff in Ukiah is must stuff for you now, okay? And so you're going to have that invisible ink problem. Now, the meeting has a fish or cut bait solution. That only applies to the meetings.
Right.
So if you screw up in complying with other parts of Ukiah, there's no fish or cut bait to protect you there. And so what's happening is associations that are looking at opting in are really focusing on, okay, what will we be required to do? What is the must, the list of musts? And can we put everything in place that we need to have in place to comply with it? And then how we're going to address the invisible ink problem. But there are some associations out there right now who were told by lawyers it's going to be really expensive to do new documents.
Right.
And their solution was, we'll just opt in and we'll figure it out from there. Not the best strategy.
The second question I hope is an easy one. We publish in our newsletter that our board meetings are the second Tuesday of every month. This time, if you want a link, just contact blah, 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 here's a link. We don't publish an agenda. Do we have to publish an agenda, or can we put that like on our Facebook page and say it's available? Does everyone need to get a mail copy or have that agenda available specifically?
You need to mail out, what you need to do is, to avoid the 14 days, is you need to establish the meeting schedule and then send out with that schedule a standard agenda, okay? It was sort of like that.
So it has to be sent out.
Yes, but you can have a basic agenda that you send out with, and then you can update it. When the board knows what it's actually going to be discussing, you can make that material available to owners in more detail. But you can't rely upon your newsletter.
Even though it's mailed to everyone.
Oh, well, okay, withdrawn.
It's
But
ma-
if your newsletter is mailed to everybody,
and it says every second Tuesday of the month
Yeah.
at this time,
yeah,
here's, get
add the
Zoom
agenda
link,
to it. Add a basic agenda to it.
and we're good to go.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Oh,
You mentioned earlier that Washington Association of, and then that I didn't get as possibly joining to get insights into all
yeah. So
this.
the Washington chapter of Community Association Institute, and so their website is wscai.org.
I can send a link to that website when I send out the slides from tonight.
So in stating that you can send out a basic agenda, so you can say the date of the meeting, where it's going to be, old business, new business,
Yeah.
financials, without
Yeah.
being specific. So at the meeting, you can add in specifics.
Basically, yes, but there's a good faith component, okay? If you're hiding the ball, where you've got this basic agenda, but you really know that at this meeting, you're really going to, under new business,
Put in
make
like
a big decision.
a budget decision or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, then don't game it. Don't game it. What I think the responsible associations are doing is they're sending out the base agenda, and then as the board packet comes out, they know what's going to be at this board meeting, and they can make that available to owners at the same time. And so if the owner says, well, I didn't get 14 days of that, the response is, you got it as soon as the board got it. All of us were on the same page about what the agenda is here, and then when it got revised, all of us had the same information. Yeah.
Okay, we're wrapping up on time here, so we'll take one or two more questions.
We have a homeowners portal where we can post information about meetings and things. Would it be appropriate to put the agenda there without having to spend postage to mail it out to everybody?
No. I think the notice needs to be, it's an official notice, so it needs to be mailed.
Can it be
unless
emailed?
What?
Email?
If they consent it to email, then yes.
Anybody have a final question for Terry here? One more question. Hang on, Donna.
Oh, this is always the hardest one.
You suggested that there are some rewards for opting in or just becoming compliant. And I don't know what is it that we gain
Yeah, so what are some of the upsides?
in it for us?
Yeah. So what are some of the upsides if you opt in to a Kiowa? What's hard to remember because all we focus on is all the bad things. But one example is that if you're a condominium, you can by rule create a process for inspecting high-risk components. Right now, you have to amend your declaration to enable you to do that, but the statute says you can just do that by rule. Another thing that it does is rental caps for condominiums are a big issue, where you set a cap on the number of units that can be rented, so you don't become an apartment, and those are really hard to get it approved. Kiowa says you can do it by rule, up to whatever the underwriting requirements say. Those are two that come to mind. They don't help you that much if you're not in a condominium. But there are other procedural benefits. But I'm so focused on the bad that yeah, I mean, lawyers aren't used to being asked, what is good about the law?
I am one of you.
Oh, okay.
And thus I wondered.
Yeah.
That, because you've worked both sides of this street. And
Yeah.
You know that there seems to be a natural tension
Yes.
between them and us.
Yes. But what Kai was trying to do is, Kai was trying to say, look, there's only us.
Well, and I think that the procedural stuff
Yeah.
is what is really good, and that
Yeah.
is the protection
Yeah.
in itself.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's like those land use signs. You know, when you drive down the street and there's a big sign, notice of proposed land use action, and you think, I should check that out, and you don't stop. And then every time you drive by, you think, okay, and you don't. And then the sign's gone, and in the back of your head, you're like, uh-oh, this isn't good. And then it starts, 6 months later, all the construction happens. Well, you don't make a fuss because you had your chance, okay? A lot of this Kiowa stuff is like the notice of proposed land use action, where you're not going to get a bunch of people showing up at meetings. You're going to have a bunch of people who had opportunities to inform themselves, and they just sat in the boat, and they're like, as long as my assessments don't go up. Yeah, there you go, yeah. So, yeah. And so it protects boards against those people jumping up.
Thank you so much, Terry. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Thank you, Terry.